Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your year-ahead horoscope and astrology forecast for the zodiac sign of Aquarius for the entire year of 2025. All right, so my horoscopes are designed primarily for those that have either their sun sign in Aquarius or especially your rising sign in Aquarius. And I'm going to give a big picture overview of some of the major transits that are going to happen and major themes for you over the course of the next 12 months. So let's jump right into it. So here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the year. And it shows how there's some clusters of planets in different sectors of your chart over the next 12 months. So these are some of the major transits I'm going to be talking about over the course of the next of this video. And I'm going to go through them roughly in this sequence. And here is a slide that lists some dates if you want to go back and refer to that later for more specifics on some of the time frames involved on each of these transits. All right, so let's jump into the first transit I want to talk about, which we open the year with, which is the Mars retrograde that's happening in your 7th house of relationships and your 6th house of work and health. So Mars just went retrograde in December of 2024 at the very end of the year here. It slowed down and it did a U-turn in your 7th house of relationships. And then in early 2025, Mars is going to move back into your 6th house of work and health. So especially for those of you with day charts, this can be kind of a challenging transit where it can kick up some dust and there can be some challenges or some strife or conflict that arise in the sphere of relationships with other people, whether it's either romantic relationships or close one-on-one business partnerships. You could find yourself at this time having some significant fights that arise or some significant tensions. And in some instances, this can lead to a severing or a cutting off of certain relationships in your life at this time. So sometimes that doesn't have to be like the worst case scenario. Sometimes it can be necessary, but other times it can just indicate a period of significant conflict. So one of the things that I always recommend is to exercise caution during this time when it comes to getting in fights, especially with close one-on-one relationships in your life, because sometimes what you think is just a minor little argument can sometimes snowball and turn into a much larger conflict during this time if you're not careful. So that's some of the energy that we move into the year with. And then Mars retrogrades back into your 6th house of work and health. And that can sometimes bring up some issues of conflict in the workplace. There can be some challenges that arise for you at work, or you could get into some fights with people at work, especially if you find yourself in any sort of managerial position where you have somebody working for you. There could be more conflict with somebody in that position at this time. It's also a good period. It's a good time to take care of your health and to be extra cautious when it comes to health matters, especially in the first 4 months of this year while Mars is moving through Cancer, because sometimes there can be health issues that arise that we have to deal with at this time. So it's good not to take additional chances or risks with our health during this period, because sometimes Mars can lead us to impulsiveness or lead to having a lot of energy in this area of our life, but sometimes that can lead us to not think ahead or to do something risky that could have some sort of negative health implication if we're not careful. So dealing with health matters, trying to manage things in terms of work and health. And finally, because Mars is retrograding from your 7th house of relationships into your 6th house of work and health, it's possible that this transit could connect together those two seemingly separate areas of your life at this time and show some sort of crossover between relationships affecting your health or relationships and partnership affecting your work or something like that. So pay attention to those potential crossovers. That's going to be especially the case during the first 4 months of the year, but really Mars is not finished with this sector until June or something like that. So it's really the first half of the year that this transit is in effect with greater or lesser intensity at different points. So the good news, though, is that starting in the entire second half of the year, starting in June, Jupiter's going to move into Cancer and into your sixth house of work and health. So whatever dust Mars kicks up in this area of our life, in the first, especially 4 months of the year, Jupiter's going to come in and just sweep things up. It's going to improve things with respect to our health, with respect to our work, and other sixth house topics. So this looks like actually a very excellent time for work and health, where whatever strife or difficulties or obstacles or conflicts come up early in the year will probably be resolved in the second half of the year. And things, in some instances, may be better than they ever were before once Jupiter goes into that sector of our chart. And that's going to last for the entire second half of the year, all the way into the first half of 2026. So it's a very positive transit for improving your health, getting more healthy. If you've had health issues in the past, like potentially finding some resolution or something that actually helps bring some relief or fixes certain things. There's a lot of really good potentials there. And similarly at work, if you were having some issues at work, the sixth house, when Jupiter goes through it, is often a period where things are going well at work, where you find like a good job, especially if there was a break earlier in the year, and just generally a period of hope and optimism and success in that area of your life. So that's super good. All right, so moving on, the next set of transits, there's a cluster of like 3 different transits that are all taking place this year around your third house of communication, siblings, extended relatives, neighbors, community, and short distance travel. So the third house covers a lot of things. I did like a whole 7-hour episode on the third house not too long ago, showing all the different things that it covers. And for you, for some reason, this area of your chart is very activated this year in 2025. So the first thing that's happening is that the last eclipse is going to take place in Aries, in your third house, in the springtime around March and April. And this is the last eclipse of a series of eclipses that have been taking place there over the course of the past year, since about late 2023, basically. We started having our first eclipses in Aries and Libra. So the keywords that I use for this, for eclipses, is major beginnings and major endings. So some of this, because this is the last eclipse, this may be the culmination of a series of major changes and a series of major beginnings and endings that have been happening in your third house of communication over the course of the past 12 months. So you may be learning how to communicate differently at this time. There may be something about your communication style that's been going through some significant changes. And this is finally going to see the end result of that at this point, once we get this last eclipse in Aries. Sometimes there can also be some issues with like siblings where either they're going through some major changes or there's something about your relationship with them that's going through significant changes. That's also true for relationships, interactions with your neighbors or your neighborhood in general, and other things like that. So what's weird about this is that's one of the transits that's happening in your third house starting in the spring, but there's a bunch of other transits too. So one of them is that Saturn and Neptune, not too long after this, are going to enter into Aries and move into your third house, where they're going to form an almost exact conjunction this summer. So during the entire middle part of 2025, a lot of the energy is this Saturn-Neptune conjunction that forms in your third house of communication. So that's going to be one of the major signatures of this year. And Saturn, when it goes into the third house, can sometimes indicate that there's some restructuring or some surmountable difficulties that arise with respect to the topics of communication, of mobility, of siblings and neighbors, that there's some sort of issues that arise in this area of your life that force you to deal with them and to try to fix things to whatever extent that you can. So sometimes when Saturn goes into that area, there can be a feeling of like coldness or distance that starts to develop in your relationship with some of the third house people in your life. So if you have siblings, there could be some sort of like distance with your siblings that starts to arise at this time for some reason. This could also be the case with extended relatives, or especially with neighbors. And while it sounds weird to bring up the topic of neighbors sometimes, because that's usually not like a major facet of most people's lives, sometimes when issues come up with neighbors, or when there's relationships that become strained, it can become very notable in your life, because then it's like something that's usually in the background and is not relevant or significant suddenly becomes more relevant because it's something that you're having to deal with. So being careful to manage those relationships so that they don't fray and don't cause you additional issues, if you exercise restraint and caution, would be a good advice at this time. All right, so Saturn's going into third house. This is going to be an initial preview of a 3-year-long transit of Saturn through your third house, starting in 2025. So it's something that's going to play out over a long term, but it's going into your third house at roughly the same time that Neptune goes into your third house, right around the time that that eclipse takes place in the spring. So Neptune entering your third house is a much more long-term, like decade-long transit. And what's tricky about Neptune going to the third house is that normally the third house represents communication and how we communicate what we think and believe to the world and how effectively we do it. And Neptune, though, is this nebulous planet that tends to bring a sense of like cloudiness or a lack of clarity to whatever area it moves into. So with Neptune moving into your third house of communication, there's something coming up here about a lack of clarity in communication that starts to arise in your life at this time for some reason. And since that's also coinciding with like Saturn moving into the third house and some challenges or restrictions to communication, there's something very interesting here that's going on that will be important to pay attention to, especially this summer when those two planets get very close to a conjunction in this sector of your chart. So on the one hand, Saturn tends to make us want to be overly focused on reality and on like the cold hard facts, the cold hard truth, whereas Neptune will pull us in an opposite direction of making us want to focus on things that are more idealistic, things that are sometimes like more like metaphysical or sort of like spiritual or religious or philosophical. And sometimes Neptune can cause us to be not very grounded in reality, or sometimes disconnected from it entirely. And there's something about this basic tension between Saturn and Neptune that's really going to play out in your third house of communication. And you're probably going to go back and forth between one or the other, and being overly realistic to the point of pessimistic in your communication style, to on the other hand being overly idealistic and maybe not fully grounded in reality in your communication style during this time. So I think you'll probably swing back and forth, but one of the goals for you should be to achieve some sort of balance or moderation between those two extremes in your life to whatever extent you can. And this summer is really going to be the first test of that, where some of those things will arise within you as well as in your external circumstances that'll force you to have to like contend with those two opposing energies. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and what that presents itself as. All right, so if that wasn't enough, there's also a Venus retrograde transit that starts in the spring, that happens in the spring, that starts in your third house of communication and then retrogrades back into your second house of finances. So with Venus retrograde in the third house, sometimes that can bring people from your past back into your life, and sometimes it can lead to reconciliations with people from your past where relationships may have separated or may have faded for some reason. So because it's a retrograde in your third house, I would think that that could have to do with like reconciling with siblings, with extended relatives like aunts or uncles or cousins, with neighbors or people from your neighborhood, which can sometimes include friends, like friends you grew up with in your local community or your local neighborhood can suddenly come back into your life for some reason. So that's going to start in your third house of communication and neighbors and everything else, and then it's going to retrograde back into your second house of finances. So this may cause you to rethink or have to retool some things financially, but especially for those of you with night charts, I think this should actually be a very positive transit for financial matters, with Venus going through your second house and then stationing direct there in Pisces. And that actually brings us into the next transit that I wanted to talk about, the next major shift in 2025, which is that the eclipses are shifting into your second house and eighth house axis, which is the financial sector of your chart. So at its core, this means that there's going to be some major beginnings and major endings when it comes to financial matters in your life at this time. So this probably already started to accelerate last year in 2024 when we had our first eclipse in the sign of Pisces in September. There's an eclipse there, and also Saturn has been transiting through your second house, which in the best case scenario is forcing you to put more structure and more work into financial matters in your life. But in the worst case scenario can also sometimes bring up some challenges and some surmountable difficulties when it comes to finances in your life. In September timeframe, I would have expected that to have been more prominent, September through November of 2024. And that's one of the good things about Saturn moving into Aries, is it's going to start to depart from your financial sector, which will probably lead to an alleviation or resolving of some of the issues and some of the slowness that Saturn probably brought to your second house of finances since early 2023, since March of 2023 when it entered that sign. So eclipses happening here, though, indicates a period of major focus and major activity and major beginnings and major endings. So there may be something about financial matters where you're starting to take your finances more seriously, where you are trying new things, and you may have a new development in your life where you start playing with the topic of money and finance and possessions and doing something new with it that sets a new foundation in your life. So this second house set of eclipses is tied in with an eighth house set of eclipses, which the eighth house represents other people's money in your life in general. So that can pertain to topics like taxes, debt, inheritance. Also, investing can be a major topic. Like this can be a period where you get into investing, or the role of like investing or having your money managed, or you managing the money of other people can become more relevant. The eighth house is also the house of shared resources with your partner, either a romantic partner or a business partner. So there may be some major changes and major beginnings and endings happening with respect to their finances, which then impact your finances in some way, either directly or indirectly. And part of the theme of this set of eclipses is showing how your finances are not independent from those of other people, but how somehow those two areas of your life are interconnected in some way. So that's something that will start in the springtime of 2025 when you get the first eclipse in Virgo, but it really gets going in September of 2025 when we have our first full set of eclipses in Virgo and Pisces, which is your second and eighth house. So really pay attention to what's happening in the financial sector around that time in September, because you'll probably see some major changes start to take place. All right, so the very last transit that I wanted to talk about today is that Uranus is departing from your fourth house of home and family and living situation, where it's been transiting since 2018, which has probably been coinciding with some pretty radical shifts in terms of your home and living situation and in terms of your relationship with your parents to some extent. And now Uranus is moving into your fifth house of children. The fifth house also represents sex and sexuality. It also represents fun and games and leisurely activities and the role that hobbies and other things like that play in your life. And with Uranus moving into this house, usually Uranus is the planet that brings sudden and rapid change that sometimes happens unexpectedly and sometimes brings things or moves things in a new direction very quickly, because Uranus also always does things super fast. So there's going to be some major shakeups in this area of your life somehow starting in 2025, where in July of 2025, Uranus goes into Gemini and into your fifth house for the first time. But this is part of a 7-year-long transit that's going to shake up this part of your life over the course of the next, like most of the next decade, through the early 2030s. So this is not something that will necessarily happen overnight, but I think it's going to be really important to pay attention to any changes that start taking place in your fifth house starting in July of 2025, because they could be a preview of a longer term shift that's going to radically transform your life in this area in some ways. So sometimes there can be issues of like freedom and like liberation and wanting to get rid of some restrictions that you feel like have been put on you in this area of your life up to this point. For those of you with children, for those of you that don't have children, sometimes this can bring children unexpectedly. For those of you with children, sometimes there's something going on in your children's life where maybe they're being a little bit, they have more of an urge for like freedom or for being a little bit less restrained than they were up to this point. And sometimes that can feel like they're going through changes really quickly or being somewhat erratic. But ultimately, that'll be like a phase in their life that will be for the best. It can also be a period in which things about your orientation towards sex and sexuality can change, and there could be some additional excitement in this area of your life. There could be some innovation where you start doing things differently for some reason, or start looking at that area of your life differently for some reason in a way that's radically different than what you had done up to this point. And especially if you feel like there's been any restrictions or anything's holding you back in that area up to this point, you may find yourself wanting to get rid of those just in order to be free and in order to find and be your most authentic self. The last area is just games and hobbies, where sometimes that sounds like a minor area of the person's life that shouldn't be important, but sometimes having a hobby or having something that you do for fun and enjoyment and pleasure can actually be the things that make life enjoyable and make life worth living sometimes for some people when other things in a person's life are not going as well. So there may be some sort of new hobby or new activity or new pastime that you get into that you find really exciting and that you start focusing on a lot more at this time. And it could have some sort of broader transformative effect on your life that ultimately is liberating and is ultimately good. So that's something to pay attention to as well when Uranus goes into your fifth house in the second half of 2025. And then Uranus will come back and dip back into Taurus next year, I think in 2026, for last transit through your fourth house of home and family. But then eventually in like a year or two, Uranus will just be like fully into your fifth house. So the second half of 2025 is just the initial preview of that, but it should be an initial preview where you'll start seeing some changes happening already right at the beginning of that transit. So pay attention to it and keep an eye out for it, because that's a big transit that lasts for 7 years, and there could be some really good things that come with it. All right, I think that's it for this forecast. So those are the major things I want to focus on and tell you about for 2025. If you're looking for dates to launch new ventures or lucky dates basically to start things next year, I just released my 2025 electional astrology report, where I go through each of the next 12 months of next year and I highlight the single most fortunate or lucky dates I can find in each of the next 12 months using the principles of electional astrology. So in past years, people have used my reports in order to schedule major things like getting married, scheduling the date of launching a business, or going on a major journey. Anything that you really want to have a fortunate set of astrological alignments to do under, that's what my report is for. So I just launched the report, so I'm doing a 20% off sale, but only until the first week of January. So you can get the report at the discounted price right now at theastrologypodcast.com/2025 report. All right, that's it for this video. So good luck in 2025, and I'll see you again next year. I just released my 2025 astrology calendar posters, which show all of the major astrological transits this year at a glance, and you can get those at theastrologypodcast.com/merch. If you want to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I teach an online course in ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology course, which has hundreds of hours of video lectures where I teach people how to read birth charts and how to understand and predict the future using transits and other timing techniques. So you can find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Also, shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening in May of 2025 in Seattle, Washington, and it's being simultaneously streamed online at the same time. So you can find out more information at norwac.net. Finally, thanks to the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the Astrology Podcast through my page on Patreon. You can get early access to new episodes plus other bonus content by becoming a patron at patreon.com/astrologypodcast.